Arqus, the European University Alliance you belong to. Granada, Bergen, Graz, Leipzig, Lyon, Padua, Vilnius. These 7 universities have come together with a common goal for students, professors, researchers and administrative staff to participate in changing and transforming the university from the current concept into a university without barriers, international and people-centered. What does this mean for you? Participate in exchanges between universities. Gain work experience in other countries while improving your foreign language skills. Participate in alliance activities such as summer schools or workshops. Establish new collaborations with other research groups. Multiply your university's resources by 7 and much more. Visit arqus-alliance.eu and discover all the possibilities that will change your future, our future. Arqus Alliance, building bridges towards a shared future.
I'm saying good afternoon to all the participants who may be joining us on Facebook and YouTube to help Arqus University Alliance celebrate its Arqus Day. So happy Arqus Day, first of all. But also we're celebrating Erasmus Day 2020 in these strange circumstances. But today's panel discussion is about one of the areas that is dear to the heart of Arqus, and that is inclusion. And we're talking about inclusion and access and widening participation in higher education in this particular Arqus Alliance, which brings together, as you've probably seen already, 7 universities in 7 cities, different parts of Europe, all medium-sized institutions. And Arqus is one of the first cohort, or the University Alliance that was selected in the first cohort of this European initiative. I'm joined by 4 participants who are, 3 of whom are from 3 different members of the Arqus Alliance and represent different stakeholders, faculty member, students, and the coordinator of the whole alliance, as well as by representative of Brussels, the Commission. Before I start the discussion, I would like to invite each of them to introduce themselves briefly to you. I will do the same. My name is Eva Grompoliak, and I'm a member of the International Advisory Committee of Arqus. and I'm the former Secretary General of the International Association of Universities and have collaborated with many of the institutions involved in Arqus in the past. So perhaps we will start with Harpasev.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Harpasev Arnarsdóttir. I'm working in the European Commission, the Directorate General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture. I work in the Higher Education Unit and most specifically on the Erasmus Plus program. And in these past 2 years, I've been mainly working on the design of the new program, paying specific attention to inclusion matters, of course. So I'm very happy to be here today to discuss this very important topic.
Dorothy, will you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thank you very much, Eva. I am Dorothy Kelly, Vice Rector for Internationalization at the University of Granada and the coordinator of the Arqus European University Alliance. It is, if I may, a great pleasure to participate in this panel to celebrate our first Arqus Day. The date itself is the 18th, but that's a Sunday, so we didn't feel it was a day to hold an academic event. But the date marks the formal launch of the Alliance, the constitution of the Rectors' Council here in the University of Granada, following the selection process, as Eva has said, in the first round, the first pilot round in 2019. Although, of course, work on the Alliance started at least 15 months before that, as we prepared the application and looked at the various areas that we really wanted to work in, including, and right from the very beginning, the 7 universities really wanted to work in inclusion as a central issue for our Alliance. So we're very, very happy. I'm very happy to participate in this panel today. Of course, we didn't expect when we started that this would have to be a virtual event, and we would love it to be an in-person event, but I think it's a good sign of the resilience of the Alliance itself that we are able to continue our activities online.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I will now turn to the University of Padua, member of this panel, Benedetta.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I am Benedetta Zatti. I'm the head of the inclusion sector at the Student Services Office at Padova University. And I'm also the Action Line 2 chair in Arqus. Action Line 2, which is about widening access, inclusion, and diversity. So I'm really happy to be here today to have the opportunity to share with you what we're doing, our developments in Action Line 2.
Thank you very much. And now to our last panelist who represents the students, Claudius.
So hello, everybody. I'm Claudius Melius. I'm from Vilnius University. I'm studying in Masters in Quality Management, and also I'm the president of Student Council of Arqus for the last days. It's also a year for us as we established Student Council, which is working in the Arqus Alliance. We're developing positions and also the ideas and criteria what students could benefit from this Arqus Alliance, and also what could bring to our studies, and also for our future researchers and everything. So we look to Alliance as a possibility to involve every student in every university, to develop their ideas, to develop to become one big alliance of inclusion of every university and every student. This is the idea of this project. So we're kindly feeling this really well, and we're also managing that in our student council as one of the main criteria in equality of genders, equality of universities, equality of inclusion of everybody. So I think that's one of the main things, and it's really hard to imagine that a half year we met in Brussels and we thought how we would manage and work together, and now we are just moving ourselves and giving a new way of thinking and also a new path of inclusion. So I think that brings us also benefits which we could go on.
Thank you. You're obviously the right person to have on a panel that talks about widening access and inclusion. So you'll have lots more to say during this 1 hour. And I should remind everyone we have 1 hour, so we'll move right towards the questions. And I would like to ask Harpa to begin because social cohesion through education, including through higher education, is a very high priority for the Commission. And it was one of the criteria that looked at the European University Initiative's proposals. So I'd like to know whether the Commission thinks that COVID-19, which brought about online education for many, which forces us to really rethink mobility. I'd like to know whether it has taught us something about how to address inclusion and how to make sure that diversity can remain part of the social cohesion and part of the Alliance's work.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very relevant question. Of course, you address a very important topic here, and you're absolutely right that social inclusion and diversity are at the heart of the European Universities Initiative, and also the new Erasmus program, and our big, policy communications that happened at the end of September, the European education area in particular. So we were already striving for being more inclusive and achieving a program where really mobility would be a reality for all. Every student should be able to find a relevant opportunity within the program to be able to benefit from mobility. So we had been engaged in a co-creation process involving stakeholders from all over Europe, really sitting down together and analyzing systematically the main barriers and how we can address inclusion issues in the new program. So we came up with a very holistic and comprehensive plan to deal with this. But of course, also something that we did not expect was that we would find ourselves in a pandemic situation right before the launch of the new program, and where the best way to deal with it in most cases was making a rapid shift towards online cooperation, virtual mobility, blended mobility. This brought, of course, a lot of challenges, but also a number of opportunities because it gave us the chance to learn some very important lessons ahead of time and ahead of our new program, which was already looking towards incorporating more innovative pedagogies into the program, blended mobility, online cooperation, etc. So we were able to identify some digital disparities, if you will. We saw a bit of a difference between countries and also individual institutions, how easily they could shift towards this kind of an environment and an environment to cooperate. And it just highlighted simply how digital infrastructure is also super important to assure inclusion and the resilience of our education systems. So we learned these lessons in the process while finalizing these important communications. And of course, this started to take front and center stage in, for example, the updated Digital Education Action Plan and other policy documents. So, I mean, I try to be an optimist. I want to see a silver lining here. And you could envisage that if we had not had this experience ahead of the program, we would have been learning these lessons perhaps later on. So we were able to address this also now into the new program and build some additional mechanisms in the new program to really address inclusion. Of course, now with COVID-19 situation, I tend to explain the Commission's response to this crisis as a sort of twofold response, because first, we had to do pure crisis management. How do we help universities and students that find themselves in the middle of their mobility experience, trapped somewhere, not able to finish their studies online? So we put in place measures to deal with this. And I mean, I could, of course, present this in a full presentation, but let me just touch upon the key principles, maybe. we wanted to apply full flexibility. We wanted universities and students to have every means to come up with whatever solution to manage things. And wanted to allow the students, of course, to minimize their risk and allow them to maintain their grants, however they would be finalizing their mobilities. It was really the time to be as flexible as possible to facilitate solutions. And then as a second step, we unfortunately find ourselves still in this ongoing situation. So we had to think proactively, how can we try to facilitate mobility in these sort of uncertain times? So we drafted a new communication and sent towards the national agencies and universities, where we said that blended mobility would be introduced sort of ad hoc a year before the new program, where students and staff can start their mobilities online and then go abroad when this becomes possible. And even if they would not be able to comply with the minimum requirements of the current program in terms of physical mobility, then okay, they can also then have a shorter physical mobility, and universities would be allowed to fund that proportionally using the current funding rules that we have. Of course, it's difficult to manage a situation like this when you're bound by a legal framework that was put in place 7 years ago, and people are probably not thinking about this situation when they drafted that proposal. But luckily, the new program is around the corner, and we've been able to build in these flexible mobility opportunities also as well into the new program, where the rules have been designed really to facilitate also quality blended mobility, flexible mobility opportunities, short-term mobility, etc., where the mobility is being designed from the start to take place in a blended format. That is a different situation than I wanted to do a full semester mobility, and now I'm just carrying it out in the best way that we can just to cope with things. So I think I will leave it at that for now. But if later, maybe I could then come back and try to explain also how the new program will deal with inclusion sort of holistically. Because I think also in the context of the European universities, I think it's very important to be aware and to see all of the mechanisms that have been built into the new program, not only to foster inclusion as such, but also to support the work of the European University Alliances and other universities that want to be inspired by the work that is being done in these alliances, and how they can also already start to transform their institutions using other opportunities in the program. European Universities Alliances is not supposed to be an exclusive club. We want them to pilot, test, but then also to disseminate their findings. And then there are other mechanisms within the program where other universities can take this inspiration, they can apply for additional funds, and they can also start to do the same experimentation within their universities. So I'll leave it at that, but I would very much like to come back to the program then later.
Okay, thank you very much. And I agree with you that we need to look at the issue of inclusion well beyond impacting on mobility, but inclusion and widening access and participation in a much broader sense. And yes, I'm sure we'll try and come back to you to learn more about the future mechanisms that will be possible. But let me turn now to Dorothy Kelly, who is the coordinator of this Arqus Alliance, to ask, in a sense, for her to tell us what the most important impact of COVID-19 has been on the partner institutions, but more importantly, to see to what extent being in an alliance helped to have a shared platform for learning. Is that what Arqus became, or did the notion of crisis management locally take precedence? Were you able to work as an alliance to share the platform, or did you see the priorities locally pulling you away to address the needs of each partner's local circumstances? So can you share with us some of your insights on that?
Sure, Eva, thank you very much. I think it's a bit of both. I don't think the answer is either one or the other. And I think also the situation has changed as the pandemic advanced and as time went on. I think it is very true that on the positive side, being in an alliance and being able to share the experience of what was happening in an emergency situation in each of our 7 universities was very positive. It allowed us to share the experience of moving very rapidly to online learning and teaching, of moving very rapidly to online assessment, which has been a major challenge in many universities, of how to introduce health and safety measures as there was a partial return to on-campus activity, or looking even at more specifics such as how to promote virtual exchange in order to replace a lot of the physical mobility which had been planned. So I think there's a very positive side there, where definitely Arqus, as I believe most of the other alliances which were up and running, and this is the results of the Commission's survey say this, all of the alliances point to the learning experience being shared and this being positive. So on the one hand, that, of course, part of that was possible because many of the alliance activities were already using technology for communication. I mean, clearly, we have a whole series of bodies across the alliance. Claudia was speaking earlier about the student council. We have a steering committee, we have a rector's council, each of the action line boards, and I'm sure Benedetta will speak about the inclusion board, meet on a very, very regular basis. And of course, it simply would not have been sustainable for all of those meetings to be in person, to be physical meetings, even before the pandemic struck. So I think the fact that we had already factored in a lot of virtual activity and use of technology for communication and for meeting was very important also. But then I think there is, of course, the downside. And of course, it is true that when the pandemic initially struck, there was a time when it was very, very clear that we were all in emergency mode. We all had local emergency priorities. And I think there was a hiatus, there was a short period there at the beginning of the pandemic where local demands took over, where urgent priorities took over. Harpa has been speaking about how the Commission has introduced flexible ways of helping our students, but of course each of our universities, as very highly internationalized universities, had a large number of students on mobility programs abroad and a large number of students who were studying at our universities from other universities all over the world, and looking after those students has been a major, major task. That, of course, took resources away from what we were doing initially in alliance activities. But if I can point to what, for me, has perhaps been the most serious negative impact of the pandemic on the alliance and on the forming of the alliance, and that is, as all of you will be aware, that we were to hold our first annual Arqus conference in mid-March at the University of Lyon. Now, I believe I'm a very, very strong believer in multilateral cooperation, but I'm a very, very strong believer in multilateral cooperation being based on mutual knowledge and mutual trust. And precisely the fact that we were unable to hold our first annual conference, where it was planned that we would have 250 to 300 people from all 7 universities present, with lots of time for networking, with lots of time for interpersonal relations to develop and strengthen, has certainly, in my opinion, been a major issue for developing perhaps not the actual activities, but for ensuring the community involvement in the alliance, which we believe so strongly in. So, I think, so a bit of both, positive aspects, of course, but also negative aspects.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think you paint a very balanced picture of what has been the experience. And it is true that most universities have managed to move forward, have managed to operate, have managed to work. But there are things that are unfortunately slipping by us. And one of the things that I think all of us are experiencing is that we work well with those we already know. But what happens is that you're having much more difficulty broadening the base, and therefore in this case broadening the ownership base of the alliance, and that's going to need to take place later. But I'm sure that it will be successful because you will have achieved certain results and you will be able to share those. So on an optimistic note, that's what I would focus on. Let me turn to Benedetta, because you coordinate the specific action line on widening access and inclusion within Arqus. And so I'd like you to, if you can, describe a little bit some of the achievements that you have already made, even though it's a young alliance. But I would also like you to talk a little bit about what has been difficult, and importantly, where the different stakeholders within the university may have acted as real helpers, but also some of the obstacles to really embedding the inclusion agenda in both Padua, but also and especially in the Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, I would like to start with what I think is the main goal, the macro goal of Action Line 2, widening access, inclusion and diversity, which is also one of the major achievements of this first year of Arqus. And that's sharing within the Alliance a common and broad, and I would underline the word broad, inclusive perspective. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic actually showed what we can intend for a broad, inclusive perspective, with the ultimate goal, of course, of enabling people, especially those from the less underrepresented groups, meaning students and staff with a migrant or even refugee background, women in STEM, gifted or elderly students with disabilities and learning disorders, even with intellectual or psychiatric disabilities, and so on. And to ensure that all our contexts in the Alliance can actually guarantee to each person with his or her uniqueness and diversity at the same time full participation in academic, but also social and civil life. And also to ensure that our contexts can actually address the key challenges that we are now facing. And again, the COVID-19 pandemic showed what kind of challenges we have to face and we will face. And the big achievement was in this very first year to have 208 to 210 people on board for this Action Line 2, which is a huge number of people actually working at the 13 activities which are foreseen in this Action Line, and actually negotiating and sharing a common and broad inclusive perspective, because it is not something that we can give for granted. What do we intend for inclusion? What do we mean when we we talk about inclusive language, gender neutral language, equal opportunities, equity, diversity, and so on. So that's a big acquisition of this first year. I'm sure about that. But then we have, of course, specific goals, and we are developing these goals through a transversal and cross-sectoral inclusion strategy, which foresees research-based policies and models that are not only for us in Arqus, but are thought to be for the future alliances as well. We have interdisciplinary informed specific goals, trajectories, and actions that we are developing in the action line architecture, which engages children, primary and secondary school pupils and teachers, university students and tutors, academic and non-academic staff, in development programs for, on one side, heterogeneity sensitive learning, and on the other hand, about inclusive and innovative teaching in the diverse classroom, which is what we are facing, of course, nowadays, I should say. Of course, we are thinking also about flexible and equitable access policies, for example, recognition of prior learning, both for professionals and for students, recognizing formal, informal, non-formal experiences in education. And one of the most important goals is building up a very well-connected support network for inclusion, which means also reaching out to citizens, to the regional, local and regional communities and organizations. So we have to actually engage. Engagement is the big word about Action Line 2, engaging also decision makers out there through awareness raising activities, for example, promoting, of course, human rights, inclusion, social innovation, and so on. Among the achievements, I think we managed to map quite well within the 13 activities. Some of them are not finished yet and will finish in December because the COVID pandemic actually forced us to reschedule our activities and to remodule the way we actually are developing them. For example, as Dorothy was mentioning before, the board meets regularly every single month, and actually we didn't stop. We haven't stopped meeting. The 13 task forces are very much in connection among each other, and we keep track of what they do as a board and as the chair of the Action Line 2. But of course, we had to reschedule some of these activities. Anyway, we managed to map the stakeholders' needs and the state of the art within the Alliance for all the subjects we are tackling. We managed to get familiar with the most recent European recommendations and lessons to be learned. We are sharing data, best practices, and all the weaknesses and strengths of our practices. And we have also some first embryo proposals, models, and so on that we are already even uploading on our Arqus portal to be shared within the Arqus community. Of course, the most difficult part of it was really the engagement, having everyone on board immediately, or anyway from the very beginning of our activity, because we have different approaches in our universities. Some intercultural issues actually came up in that, because the way we actually managed to choose people, to recruit people, to engage people are different. And so that wasn't easy. And we actually started with all the task forces to be able to work around January, February. And then unfortunately, the lockdown kind of stopped everyone. And so it was a bit difficult to then restart. But anyway, we managed. And I think the great richness of having different approaches and different perspectives is the big point about the Alliance, the great thing about the Alliance, but at the same time, sometimes it represents an obstacle, something that we had to deal with. And it was especially so during the COVID-19 emergency. But anyway, we have restarted our cross-border communication and interaction. So I'm quite happy to say that I think we will manage to achieve all the outputs for the first year, more or less. As far as the stakeholders, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic actually again showed us that we are all vulnerable or may become vulnerable. And so what we try to do is to have on board people coming from any very different backgrounds and experiences. And so from the academic staff, non-academic staff, students, tutors in our universities, volunteers, citizens, or anyway, people from the institutions out there. And I think that we and they are all stakeholders in this sense.
Thank you very much. I think that that is one of the lessons learned from the pandemic, is that the excluded can shift very quickly, or the groups that we would consider as excluded can all of a sudden shift very quickly, and we need to learn. But it also, I think, increased our awareness of the real gaps that exist in our societies with respect to access to technology, access to resources. So I think the work on inclusion will become even more important rather than less important. Let me now turn to Claudia, because I think you already began telling us how important inclusion is, and for the student group within Arqus. So perhaps I wonder whether you can tell us, why do you think students feel that inclusion is important? Why is it important for the student body to see themselves in a university and a university alliance that places such high priority on inclusion? And in each of the partner institutions, the category or those who are excluded may be different. And do you think, despite those differences, that the lessons learned through Arqus can be really useful despite the differences, cultural and socioeconomic, and even the way we define inclusion? Do you think Arqus can still share the approaches to inclusion despite these differences? And then finally, what do you think your role as students should be in making the Alliance inclusive? So lots of questions, but I'm sure you can answer all of them.
I'll try to do this. Yes, it's quite a lot of questions, but I would start from the one of the ideas which I read in social media through weeks. It's one idea from a student from University of Bologna. He was saying he was preventing about the mission. He was kindly regarding expressing his idea about the role of the university and the mission nowadays. And he asked for those who were reading his social media post. He asked about that the university is now showing its mission in this whole time, and it's the time to show its most vulnerable place, what role university plays in the town, in the country, in the all continent, in the whole world. Why the research and studies are important in the 21st century, why people should get involved, why people should introduce themselves to have long life learning ideas through the year. We haven't talked about this, but inclusion plays with this idea, the long life learning and the possibilities which have been showed through this situation which we faced. And nowadays it's really important. The inclusion of a whole group, of whole society, which we are, in which we are, and society which understands the university, its idea. So I think there are a lot of ideas, and Bernadetta already told how Arqus is playing this. And I think the whole situation of European University Alliances helped at this situation, because we had information at its time. We could look how people, researchers are facing this situation, what they are using, what kind of tools, what kind of ideas. Everybody were just looking forward for the information through how to help the students to come back to their own countries. I also faced this situation when your students from your university are whenever in the Europe, and you have to find the path to help them, to contact them, to help them to come back for their own countries. And that's the only thing which is shown by the situation. Nowadays, we're facing what we can bring, what kind of inclusion parts, that it's really important to have free subjects for the society, to show subjects for researchers, for society, to bring what universities are doing in what they have done in pandemic situation, what solutions they had brought, and to bring them and to give a really great part of it in the town, in the country, all wherever the world. And also the inclusion as a student when you can't move, when you are a bit locked down, or because the situation is different in every country, there has to be more possibilities to have a lot of elective subjects which you can choose in the university. The only subject which you can listen whenever the university is, and the programs has to open that. Whenever also we have to widen the access. Even the situation now we are facing is hard, yeah, but it's the second time. Now we know more about it, and now we can widen place for students to, and also for all university stakeholders to bring and to also to pass the ideas and to have different virtual blending and physical meeting, and because it's a must to share the experiences, the ideas. And this is the mission of the 21st century university, to share the ideas of quality, of different quality, which now we are facing. We have to, when we are talking about the evaluation of quality, how to evaluate the quality of virtual blending course, what kind of benefits you are getting from it, what is quality of studies brought in virtual learning, what kind of an ideas, what brings us new. That's, I think, here has to be more discussion about that. And institutions as European University Association, also national institutions, quality assurance agencies, they have to talk about that. Universities should bring the discussion about the quality of virtual learning. And I think that one of the ideas which we're seeing a European Quality Assurance Forum that will be online and free for everybody once more. Now everybody can join and see the ideas. And backing to role of student, I think all the themes are, without student, they couldn't be spread. The student is like one of those for whom the inclusion is really important. And the 21st the 21st century university should have as wide inclusion as it can for everybody, because the knowledge and the ideas of long life learning should be spread upon the university, and the university should give that to their students. And it doesn't matter what social economic welfare you are, there has to be a possibilities to come here to university. And student council is doing that in Arqus Alliance, and we're talking about all these ideas. And now I think there will be a lot of discussion in all action line boards and action lines of Arqus Alliance how the ideas is seen by students and what students could also bring to these kind of ideas. Because a year ago or 2 years ago, it was a different situation. Now we are feeling differently. We know more new way things, and these kind of discussions are really, really important to have this kind of inclusion where we discuss a lot of different subjects in one way. So I think that's when we will feel the inclusion from different aspects and different stakeholders, we'll have better 21st century university and alliances.
Thank you very much. Yes, you see the pandemic in a way as a true opportunity, and working more openly and in a more inclusive fashion. And I think in some respects you're absolutely right. But I am also conscious of the downside that Dorothy has brought. I have been following the questions that we have received from participants. And instead of picking them one or another, in the last 15 minutes that we have, let me just highlight all of them. There are about 6. And please decide which one you would like to answer, because some of them are more directed to specific issues that you will feel comfortable. So the first question is about, most of them are about mobility, I should say. So the first question is about blended and virtual mobility. And the question is, will we, through those modes of virtual or blended mobility, reach the most vulnerable in society? The second question is whether, because of the way we now have to conduct mobility, will we create a first class and second class mobility experiences? So issue of quality. How is Arqus dealing with the travel restrictions and mobility opportunities? So this is really specific to the pandemic and the restrictions being imposed. The goal of 50% mobility is part and parcel of the European Universities Initiative. What does this mean in terms of inclusion in mobility for Arqus? Is a question. And then finally, a very important question: can students have a meaningful mobility experience when most of it is virtual? I think this is the million-dollar question that every university is asking, not just within the European Universities Alliance, but those are the questions that our participants have submitted. And I'd like to let you answer them, and perhaps jump in, raise your hand, and I will, and take the microphone, and I will.
I would be happy to start addressing some of those issues, and maybe then we can go into the more specific issues regarding Arqus. So I think that these are very important questions that are being asked. How will we achieve wider inclusion, specifically in mobility? So I want to narrow down the discussion a little bit, because one thing is access to higher education in general, having more inclusive higher education systems. So, and these are topics that the European universities, of course, are dealing with. Student-centered curricula, lifelong learning, micro-credentials, flexible learning pathways. All of those things are being addressed to, have wider inclusion in our higher education systems in general. And then the second question is, if we say that, the skills that students need and society needs to, thrive in the digital age, to be able to deal with the climate change and tackle these societal issues, if we conclude that mobility and transnational, transdisciplinary, challenge-based approaches are the way to achieve those very same skills, then we arrive to the conclusion that we have to make sure that also once you have a diverse student group within your university, they should also all be able to access mobility opportunities that suit them. So then here I want to zoom in. What is the new Erasmus Plus program going to do to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible and we achieve these higher levels of mobility? So just to touch upon the main points, and I referenced earlier, the co-creation process, sitting everybody down and having a holistic approach. Well, I have to say, Benedetta mentioned so many aspects in her presentation that touched upon exactly what we want to do. And I think this is a result of the bottom-up approach as well. That we want to have at the level of the program a sort of European framework, harmonized terminology across sectors, so we're all speaking the same language when we're talking about this issue. It's really difficult to know, are we achieving anything if people all understand the topic of inclusion differently? So from our perspective, we want to take a very broad, holistic approach at the European level, say that what we're trying to target in higher education is not just the typical groups that we think about when we're talking about inclusion, those with special needs, people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. These, of course, are very important. But in addition to that, it's also students that are enrolled in programs where mobility in general has been difficult. This is a major obstacle as well to mobility. If your faculty, your professors are not supportive, are not guaranteeing recognition for those courses, the program is structured in a way where you don't find any possibility to go abroad. That is a major issue. Also, students that have caregiving responsibilities, are parents, have to work to support themselves. We also need to provide them opportunities that are relevant for them at the point in time that we meet them. And also we have to keep in mind that fear of going abroad, lack of self-confidence, this is also a major barrier to mobility. And I think we have a large group of students out there that going somewhere by myself, figuring everything out by myself is maybe not the best first introduction to mobility. Maybe there's a different way to reach out to those student groups, get them introduced to mobility, and then ultimately going abroad on a long-term physical student mobility. And I think when we talk about blended and virtual mobility, we are, the gold standard remains to have also long-term physical mobility. But if we have harmonized terminology, we have best practices put at the level of the program. So this means the new charter that not only emphasizes equality, but also equity, which is a very important distinction to make in the context of inclusion. And I think, oh, sorry, we're running out of time. Yeah, okay, I'll pass the floor on to the other speakers. And we're going to have to do a take two on this. But yeah, indeed, addressing these topics holistically and making sure that universities really use blended and virtual mobility also to diversify the offerings. And the European universities creating flexible curricula that allow for mobility and that allow for automatic recognition. I think here is really the added value also of the European universities to make mobility a reality for all.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time, and I do want others to be able to also enter into this, especially the second or the last question that was asked, whether it is really possible to have a quality virtual experience, because for the past 30 years, maybe even more, we have focused on the physical mobility because of not just the academic aspects, but the holistic approach to being exposed to another culture. Mm-hmm. So the issue about quality in a blended context is the one that perhaps we need to look at. So anyone would like to jump in?
Could I briefly just say, I think you're absolutely right, Eva, to underline the quality aspect. And I think that while it is true that during the pandemic, we have all had experiences of what has been called virtual mobility, or what this academic year is being called blended mobility. And I come back to the terminology, which Harpa has underlined is so important. What we've experienced has been an emergency response to a situation. And it has, to my mind, in no way been a real experience of quality blended mobility, or of quality virtual exchange, because in order for virtual exchange or blended mobility to be a quality experience, it needs to have been designed specifically for those virtual environments in which it takes place. And I think that is the only way that we can ensure that it is a meaningful experience. Simply taking classes online from another university is not a specifically designed virtual exchange experience. And I think that one of the things that we really want to take on board in Arqus is how to develop that meaningful experience for student mobility, but also for staff mobility, for staff development, staff of all kinds, academic staff, non-academic staff, and so on. And one of the things that Arqus has done has been to set up a Pathfinder group to look at the future of mobility. And here we're sharing experience from all 7 universities and looking at how we can ensure that the inclusive potential of virtual exchange, I don't like the term virtual mobility since we're talking about terminology, the transformative potential of virtual exchange needs to be quality virtual exchange, it needs to be meaningful, and we need to pool our resources to make sure that that's what's happening.
Yes, and if I can connect to what Dorothy was saying, and Harpa as well, I think we are now in the position and condition to actually plan from the very beginning for something new to be created. And since we are doing that, we should keep in mind from the very first step the involvement of experts, of accessibility, for example. Inclusion means also to allow everyone to be in a comfortable zone, a comfortable and welcoming context. It doesn't matter if it is in presence or online. So if we plan from the very beginning for virtual exchanges, for example, which are thought for everyone, considering many different aspects of diversity, not only visual impairments or, I don't know, hearing impairments and so on, but even intercultural important differences, language or digital device, for example, we are going to do well. If we don't keep it in mind from the very beginning, it will be very difficult to adapt. And that's not about inclusion. I mean, that is what we used to do years ago. It is about personalizing a single individualized intervention on one person, but that's not inclusion. So I mean, I feel it's important to really reflect about this aspect.
Thank you very much. I agree. And I think that, thank you, Dorothy, for mentioning the staff mobility issue as well. Faculty and staff mobility. On the one hand, I think the pandemic allows for having more visiting faculty members giving lectures ad hocly. It's much more difficult to have mobility for staff that is meaningful and that is really part of their professional life, because just because it can be offered online doesn't mean that their responsibilities, which are present because they're at home or in their institution, continue. So there is a different design and a different model to consider that takes that into consideration. Because Claudius is focusing on quality management, perhaps you'll have the last word on the quality experience of a mobility that is either blended, virtual, or an exchange that is blended or virtual. Please.
Yeah, I already listened how Dorothy and Bernadetta was talking about Arqus as inclusion tool to every student. So I think what mobility programs brings to every student, firstly, is the cultural experience. And this point is really lost when you are thinking about exchange programs as they were built ages ago. I think it's one of the most vulnerable points which you are feeling at the time when you're sitting in the university, in different country, in different society, which bringing you the quality of knowledge, the quality of how you can share the experience which you have in your own country, and you can compare it to the experience which you are facing at that specific time in the university where you are, and in those societies where you are. So I think it's one of the aspects which should be mentioned, and it's really important. And when we're talking about the virtual exchanges, you can't feel this, and the quality of it will be lost. So we can talk only about the quality as the same aspects as we're talking about the studies which we're facing, and face-to-face studies. It's the criteria are the same. Only thing that is the involvement, and also student-oriented peer-to-peer learning, it's really important. Also psycho-emotional environment is really important, and it's also the criteria of quality over here. It's new criteria here, and these kind of situations, because you're learning not in the group, and you're learning by the distance, and this is one of the things which is hard to improve of quality. So I hope my master thesis will be about the European alliances and the ESG adaptation in the universities. Okay. So I hope I will bring some ideas with that. So also it will be about the quality of studies, so, and virtual things.
Thank you so much. I think our time is up. It's 3:01 and I was told 3 o'clock. So please let me just wrap up by saying a very heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you for bringing different perspectives, your expertise, but to, in a sense, come to a certain consensus that we have a lot to learn from the pandemic, that the Commission is learning with you about what can and cannot happen. And I've been reading some material about new technology for education, and perhaps augmented reality infused educational programs will help us with the cultural dimension a little bit if we cannot resume normal mobility. But I do want to thank you, and I want to congratulate Arqus for, despite the pandemic and within the framework of those difficult times, moving forward successfully with the Alliance. I think that you are, in a sense, in a privileged position. As Claudia has said, you can learn from one another in a very, in a sense, coherent framework. And that is, I think, a privilege that the European Universities Initiative has given the alliances. So thank you. I know you'll share all of the learning on your platform, so with other universities, but thank you very much for taking part in this webinar or discussion.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.